Brother convinced my parents I was a drug dealer to get my inheritance. The DEA investigation cleared my name and revealed his own crimes. Growing up, my brother was always the golden child, while I was the screw-up who couldn't do anything right according to my parents. He played football in high school, got decent grades, and knew exactly what to say to make our folks beam with pride. Meanwhile, I was the kid who got caught sneaking out, had mediocre grades, and seemed to disappoint them at every turn despite trying my hardest to gain their approval. After high school, I moved across the country to get away from all the family drama and start fresh somewhere nobody knew me or had preconceived notions about who I was supposed to be. I found work in construction, then moved into property management, and eventually started flipping houses with money I'd saved over several years of living extremely frugally and working multiple jobs. The house flipping business took off better than I ever imagined it would, and within 5 years I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed possible. I bought a nice house in a good neighborhood, drove a decent car, and for the first time in my life felt like I was actually succeeding at something meaningful and building a future for myself. My brother, on the other hand, had stayed in our hometown and seemed to bounce from one job to another without ever really finding his footing. He'd call me occasionally asking for money, claiming he was between jobs or had some emergency that required immediate financial assistance. Being the guilt-ridden younger brother who still craved family acceptance, I usually sent him whatever he asked for without asking too many questions. Our parents were getting older, and my dad had been talking about updating his will and making sure everything was in order for when he and mom passed away. During one of our rare phone conversations, he mentioned that he was proud of how I'd turned my life around and built something substantial for myself out west. That conversation apparently didn't sit well with my brother because within a few weeks of that call, my parents' attitude toward me changed completely. They became cold and distant during our phone calls, giving short answers and seeming uncomfortable whenever I tried to share news about my business or personal life. I figured maybe they were just stressed about getting older or dealing with health issues they hadn't told me about, so I didn't push the matter too hard. But then my dad called me one evening with a tone I'd never heard from him before, serious and disappointed in a way that made my stomach drop. He told me that my brother had come to them with concerns about how I was making so much money so quickly, especially given that I'd never had much education or training in business or real estate. My brother had apparently suggested that my sudden wealth was suspicious and that maybe I was involved in something illegal. The accusation hit me like a physical blow because I'd worked incredibly hard for everything I had, often putting in 16-hour days and sacrificing social relationships and personal time to build my business. Every penny I'd made was legitimate, documented, and reported properly on my taxes. But my brother had been clever about how he presented his suspicions, never directly accusing me of anything specific, but instead asking leading questions that planted seeds of doubt. He'd wondered aloud why I was so secretive about my business dealings, why I never brought girlfriends home to meet the family, and why I seemed to have so much cash available whenever he needed help. My parents, who had always been somewhat naive about the world outside our small hometown, apparently found these concerns compelling enough to start questioning everything they thought they knew about my life and career. They began asking me pointed questions about my business that felt more like an interrogation than normal family conversation. I tried explaining the house flipping process, showing them documentation of my projects, and even offering to have them visit so they could see my operation firsthand. But my brother had already poisoned the well too effectively, and every explanation I gave seemed to make them more suspicious rather than less. The situation reached a breaking point when my dad called to tell me that he'd decided to remove me from his will entirely, until I could prove that my money was coming from legitimate sources. He said he couldn't risk having the family name associated with illegal activities, and that he and mom needed time to figure out what was really going on with my life. I was devastated not just by the loss of inheritance, which honestly wasn't even that substantial, but by the realization that my own parents believed I was capable of being a criminal. After years of working to rebuild our relationship and prove that I wasn't the family disappointment they'd always seen me as, I was right back where I started. My brother, meanwhile, had apparently stepped up to help our parents with various tasks around their house and had been spending more time with them than he had in years. He'd positioned himself as the reliable, trustworthy son who was looking out for their best interests, while I was off doing questionable things in another state. For months, I tried to find ways to prove my innocence and restore my parents' faith in me, but every conversation seemed to make things worse. They'd ask questions that were clearly coming from my brother's suggestions, and no amount of documentation or explanation seemed to satisfy their concerns. I considered hiring a lawyer or some kind of investigator to help me prove my legitimacy, but I couldn't figure out how to do that without making myself look even more suspicious. The whole situation felt like a nightmare where the harder I tried to prove my innocence, the more guilty I appeared. Then something unexpected happened that changed everything in ways I never could have predicted. I was working on a house renovation project when two men in suits showed up at the job site, asking to speak with me privately. They identified themselves as DEA agents and said they were investigating drug trafficking activities in the area. My heart nearly stopped because I thought my brother's accusations had somehow reached law enforcement and that I was about to be arrested for crimes I hadn't committed. But as the agents began asking their questions, it became clear that they weren't investigating me at all. Instead, they were asking about my brother and whether I'd noticed anything unusual about his recent behavior or financial situation. They wanted to know about the money I'd been sending him and whether he'd ever mentioned anything about his work or business dealings. It turned out that my brother had been using my legitimate success as a cover story for his own illegal activities. He'd been telling people in our hometown that his money was coming from his successful businessman brother out west, using my reputation and documented success to explain his sudden wealth. The agents explained that they'd been tracking a drug distribution network that operated out of several small towns in our area, and my brother's name had come up multiple times during their investigation. They'd been watching him for months, documenting his activities and building a case against him and his associates. When they started looking into his background, they discovered that he'd been claiming to have a wealthy brother who was funding his lifestyle, which had led them to investigate me as a potential source of drug money. But their investigation into my finances and business activities had quickly revealed that everything I was doing was completely legitimate. The agents said they'd been impressed by how thoroughly documented and properly reported all of my business activities were, and that it was obvious I had nothing to do with any illegal activities. They were actually using my legitimate business records as evidence that my brother had been lying about his income sources. I felt a mix of relief and anger that was almost overwhelming. Relief that my name was being cleared by federal agents who could definitively prove my innocence, and anger that my brother had not only destroyed my relationship with our parents, but had also used my hard-earned success to cover his own criminal activities. The agents asked if I would be willing to help with their investigation by providing information about my brother's requests for money and any conversations we'd had about his work or finances. I agreed immediately, not just because I wanted to help law enforcement, but because I was furious that he'd manipulated our family situation for his own illegal purposes. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about my brother's activities than I'd ever wanted to know. He'd been involved in distributing drugs throughout several counties, using his knowledge of our hometown and surrounding areas to establish a network of dealers and customers. The money he'd been asking me for hadn't been for emergencies or between-job expenses like he'd claimed. Instead, he'd been using it to fund his drug operations, buying inventory and paying people who worked for him. I'd been unknowingly financing criminal activities while he was simultaneously destroying my reputation with our parents. The irony of the situation was almost too much to process. While I was working legitimate 16-hour days to build an honest business, my brother was using my success to cover his illegal activities and poisoning our parents against me to ensure that he would inherit everything when they passed away. When the DEA finally made their arrests, my brother was taken into custody along with more than a dozen other people who'd been part of his distribution network. The local newspaper covered the story extensively, and suddenly everyone in our hometown knew that he'd been the real criminal all along. My parents called me the day after the arrests, and I could hear the shock and guilt in their voices. They'd realized that everything my brother had told them about me was projection, and that he'd been manipulating them to cover his own illegal activities while destroying my reputation in the process. The conversation was emotional and difficult, with both of them apologizing repeatedly for believing his accusations and cutting me out of their lives. My mom was crying, and my dad's voice was shaking as he tried to explain how sorry they were for doubting me. I wanted to be angry with them for believing my brother's lies so easily, but I could hear how devastated they were by the revelation that their golden child had been living a double life. They'd not only lost a son to criminal activities, but had also nearly lost their other son due to manipulation and lies. The legal proceedings took months to unfold, and during that time, I learned even more disturbing details about my brother's activities. He'd been involved in drug trafficking for years, apparently starting small and gradually building up his operation using money he'd obtained from various sources, including what I'd sent him. He'd also been stealing from our parents, taking money from their accounts, and using their good credit to get loans that he'd used to fund his criminal activities. They'd been unknowingly financing his drug operation while he was convincing them that I was the family criminal. The manipulation had been even more extensive than I'd initially realized. He'd been systematically poisoning our parents against me for over a year, slowly building a case that I was involved in something illegal while using their trust and resources to fund his actual criminal activities. During the trial, evidence came out showing that he'd been planning to use his inheritance to expand his drug operation significantly. He'd been working to ensure that I was completely cut out of our parents' will so that he would have access to all their money and property when they passed away. The prosecutors presented evidence showing that he'd been researching ways to launder money through real estate investments, apparently planning to use legitimate business activities to clean his drug money. He'd been studying my business model not to learn how to succeed honestly, but to figure out how to make his criminal activities appear legitimate. The trial was devastating for our family, with our parents having to testify about how he'd manipulated them and used their resources. They had to admit in court that they'd been completely fooled by his lies and had nearly destroyed their relationship with their other son based on his deceptions. He was ultimately convicted on multiple federal charges including drug trafficking, money laundering, and fraud. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, and he was ordered to pay restitution to all the people he'd defrauded, including our parents. The aftermath of the trial was complicated and emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. Our parents were dealing with the guilt of having been manipulated so thoroughly, while also grieving the loss of a son who would be spending the next decade and a half in prison. They worked hard to rebuild their relationship with me, and over time we were able to move past the damage that had been done. They restored me to their will, but more importantly, they restored their faith in me and their pride in what I'd accomplished through honest work. My business continued to grow and succeed, and I eventually expanded into other areas of real estate development. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about family, trust, and the importance of maintaining detailed documentation of all business activities. I never sent my brother money again, and I haven't spoken to him since before his arrest. Our parents visit him occasionally in prison, but I've decided that rebuilding that relationship isn't something I'm interested in pursuing. The whole experience changed my perspective on family relationships and made me more cautious about trusting people, even those who are supposed to be closest to me. It also made me appreciate the value of hard work and honest success even more than I had before. Looking back, I realized that my brother's manipulation was probably motivated by jealousy and resentment about my success, combined with desperation about his own illegal activities. But understanding his motivations doesn't excuse what he did to our family or make the damage he caused any less real. The DEA agents who investigated the case told me that my situation wasn't uncommon, and that criminals often try to deflect suspicion by accusing others of the very crimes they're committing themselves. They said my brother's strategy of using my legitimate success to cover his illegal activities was actually quite sophisticated. Today, my relationship with my parents is stronger than it's ever been, built on a foundation of proven trust and mutual respect. They've seen firsthand how hard I work and how legitimate my business activities are, and they're proud of what I've accomplished. The experience taught me that sometimes the people who try to destroy your reputation are actually revealing their own character flaws and criminal tendencies. My brother's accusations against me were really confessions about his own activities, projected onto me to deflect suspicion from himself. I still flip houses and develop properties, and my business continues to grow and prosper. But now I'm even more careful about documenting everything and maintaining complete transparency in all my business dealings, partly because of what I learned during the DEA investigation. The irony of the whole situation still amazes me sometimes. While I was working honest jobs and building a legitimate business, my brother was committing federal crimes and using my success to cover his illegal activities. His attempts to destroy my reputation ultimately led to his own downfall and proved my innocence beyond any doubt. My parents learned a hard lesson about manipulation and the importance of getting facts before making judgments about family members. They've become much more careful about believing accusations without evidence and they've developed a deeper appreciation for the value of honest work and legitimate success. The experience also strengthened my resolve to continue building my business through hard work and ethical practices. Knowing that success achieved through legitimate means can withstand any investigation or scrutiny. My brother's criminal activities were ultimately unsustainable, while my honest business continues to thrive years later. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the DEA investigation hadn't revealed the truth about my brother's activities. Would my parents have continued believing his lies about me? Would I have spent years trying to prove my innocence without success? The whole situation could have destroyed our family permanently if not for the intervention of federal law enforcement. But in the end, the truth came out in the most definitive way possible, with federal agents providing documentation that not only cleared my name, but also revealed the extent of my brother's criminal activities. Justice was served, our family relationships were restored, and I was able to continue building my legitimate business with my reputation intact. The experience taught me that integrity and hard work will ultimately prevail over manipulation and criminal behavior, even when the situation seems hopeless. My brother's elaborate scheme to destroy my reputation and steal my inheritance ultimately led to his own downfall and imprisonment, while my honest business practices were vindicated by federal investigation.